Tolkien taught us a lot. There can be only one, right? So I think one to rule them all. So I guess I'm mixing Tolkien and the what's the Scottish thing where they cut everyone's heads off? What's the pop
The
culture
Scottish thing
reference?
where they cut everyone's heads off? What?
Yeah, what is it? Yeah, the movie, right? There can be only.
What is going on, networkers? And welcome to the podcast. I am Bruce. Over there, we have Erwin Toothless James. And of course, in continuing our trend with bringing on people onto the podcast to talk about interesting topics, today we are pleased to bring on Mike Bushong, who is the Vice President of Datacenter at Juniper. So, Mike, why don't you give yourself a bit of an introduction before we dive into what we're going to talk about today?
Sure. So you got the name right. It's Mike. I work at Juniper Networks. Today I'm representing primarily myself, though, so hopefully we can get into some trouble here and talk about kind of what's going on. My background's mostly on the software side. I was at Juniper 2001 to 2012, during which time I incubated things like SDN, and a lot of our automation efforts came out of my team. Even things like SD-WAN back in the early days. So I've been pretty fortunate to be on the forefront of a lot of stuff. Um, I will tell you, I drive the cheapest car that gets a carpool sticker. So what that will tell you up front is while I frequently know what's going to happen, I have utterly failed to monetize personally on how that goes. And I think that's a bit of the strategy part of some of the topics we'll get into today.
Cool, yeah. So I think to get us started, what got us talking was Juniper acquiring Apstra. So before we dive into kind of some of the more technical topics, I'd like to get your input on how did we do? So of course we did a podcast on Juniper acquiring Apstra. We speculated a little bit on where we thought things were going. Erwin had a lot of thoughts. I had some thoughts, not too many. How did we do in terms of where we positioned it, and how accurate, at least for what you can speak publicly?
Sure. So that's actually how I found you guys in the first place. I worked on an acquisition for a large number of months. It hit, and then the next thing you do is you set up your Twitter feed and you try to bask in the glory as everybody analyzes what you were thinking. And
Yep.
I will tell you, it's amazing some of the takes out there. People, they intuit a lot, like they really infer a lot from just things that are out there. I thought you all did a pretty good job. I mean, the central conclusion that you had drawn was that you could see that having a fabric manager alongside, say like an SDN overlay, and then bringing in some of the mist bits and some of the AI, that seemed to make sense long term. You were a bit befuddled by the 128 technologies and the session assurance and kind of the bit there, and so you're trying to figure out how those come together, and maybe they don't because they're different parts of the market. I thought you actually nailed it pretty well. I mean, the long and short of it is basically this. Apstra's built out an intent-based fabric management solution focused on certainly the provisioning pieces, but really moving into the day two operations. That's consistent with our general view around operations. Obviously, Mist brings in some of the AI bits, and you put those two together, and it's a little bit chocolate and peanut butter. What can be better? And so that's really the core of the strategy, how these things come together. There's obviously opportunity to integrate more beyond that. So there might be things that we do over, say, a slightly longer time horizon. But I thought you actually were pretty spot on in the short-term analysis and pretty close to how we were thinking about things internally.
Awesome. Good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super good.
I guess we can talk a little bit more about it because there were some things that we talked about on that podcast with regards to the Apstra acquisition, and more with regards to how that fits in with the current Juniper set of fabric managers with Contrail or Q Fabric Manager. Do you see like an Apstra taking over that kind of role and a phasing out of those fabric managers, or do you see more of like a parallel or different use case that this may be applied to?
Tolkien taught us a lot. There can be only one, right? So I think one to rule them all. So I guess I'm mixing Tolkien and what's the Scottish thing where they cut everyone's heads off? What's the pop culture
Scottish
reference?
thing where they cut everyone's heads off? What?
Yeah, what is it? Yeah, the movie, right? There could be a Highlander.
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 Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So
Hey, it fit the Tolkien universe. I'm a Kiwi. I feel like I get permission to either approve or disapprove the use of Lord of the Rings references, and I'm okay with this one.
Okay. So, I think when it comes to a data center, we'll lead with the Apstra bits when it comes to fabric management. Obviously our portfolio includes the underlay, it includes Contrail and the overlay. So we'll bring those pieces together over time. But when you think about like fabric management, Apstra really is the lead for us. I think what they've done around the intent-based side is kind of cool. The blueprints and modeling, certainly the multi-vendor support lets us think about how do you handle more complex environments, which kind of move beyond single vendor only. So I think there's a lot of stuff there that we'll play with. And then obviously as a company, I mean, look, if you want to go out and have 2 or 3 of everything, we're not Cisco. We can't afford to have different BUs competing for business. And so
Yeah.
I think we'll try to put as much wood behind the arrow as we can.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, you touched upon it really quickly about the multi-vendor stuff. I mean, it was a bit of an interesting play in buying something like Apstra, which made its name on the backs of the multi-vendor support, creating that abstraction layer, that intent abstraction layer, and it being able to be configured on all your primary switch vendors. Now that a vendor's acquired that technology, it puts a bit of a spanner in that a little bit to some extent. How do you see that fitting into the Apstra Juniper acquisition story, supporting your essentially your competitors from a hardware and NOS perspective?
Yeah, there's nothing we would do architecturally to the product that would break the multi-vendor bits. I mean, they've built an API broker. You put intent in, it handles translation and normalization into whatever else is out there.
Yeah.
There's no reason to break that kind of architectural separation, because you'd want to abstract, even if you're in a single vendor stack, you still want to abstract above the individual devices. Otherwise, the code ends up getting grafted together and you start to shift the org chart a little bit. So I don't think we'll do anything to change that. I do think there's practical realities. Does a vendor have permission to deliver a truly vendor agnostic management solution? I'd say a lot of vendors have ambition to do that. The market has spoken on this, probably a dozen times as we've had various network management wars. And so I think some of the same dynamics will be there. Frankly, do I think, even if we went in and said, look, we're going to manage, only Cisco stuff or only Arista switches or whatever. I think at some point, if you're Cisco or Arista, the counter to that is just to offer your management solution for free, because it creates a precarious position for them. So I think there's just some practicalities that we need to think about. So I don't think the primary motion is going to be like a pure standalone, over the top of somebody else's switches. Like that doesn't feel like it's the right way to go. I think where multi-vendor helps is if you start looking at how do you migrate, or how do you start to bridge between pod A and pod B, which might have different architectures. Can you use different sets of blueprints, or a common set of blueprints with an underlying different set of suppliers? Like that kind of stuff makes more sense. It's more consistent with how people use, and I'll put the term open in air quotes, because open can mean like a lot of stuff. But usually what people want is interoperability and interchangeability, and what Apstra gives anybody is the ability to kind of abstract above the hardware, swap the hardware out if you need to. And I think that's a good investment protection. It's a good migration story, and it happens to be true. So I think that's probably where you'll see us lean.
Yeah. So we actually have a podcast dedicated to the term open, which we recorded a couple months ago, trying to define what that means, because it tends to mean a lot of things to a lot of different people and different things to different people. The last thing that I want to touch on with the Apstra acquisition before we kind of move on to, and this will lead us into a more generic topic, which is good, but has to do with, again, something that we tried to bring into the last podcast about Apstra being acquired, was the tie into Mist AI. So it seems like Juniper's put a lot of focus on the Mist acquisition, a lot of focus on the AI story, even to go as far as having, from my understanding, like Marvis, the AI bot that is supposed to help you kind of get information from your network on fairly easily. How does Apstra and its intent-based analytics tie into the Mist AI story, and then maybe that can lead us into a more generic conversation around AI use in a data center, and kind of where you see that happening.
Yeah. So I think when we bought Mist, I think there was a lot of folks that looked at it and said, well, we had a wireless sized hole in our portfolio, and so we bought a wireless sized company. And I think that made a lot of sense, right? Campus and branch wireless are going to go along with the campus switching, and I think it made good sense to pull those things together. That being said, I actually don't think Mist was a pure wireless acquisition. The way we think about it internally is we bought an AI company, and they happen to apply AI in a wireless context. So very early on in that acquisition, we started to extend the whole notion of service assurance out to the switching line. If we can collect information from the underlying, Junos-based devices, then that gave us the ability to start to provide, better insight to what was happening, either on the wireless side generally, or really on anything beyond the WAN gateway. It's like a simple example. We had a customer that was seeing intermittent packet drops. Actually, we saw those intermittent packet drops on the controller. We let them know there's intermittent packet drops. Difficult to see. It wasn't persistent. They called us back and said, no, we think everything's fine. We reached back out to them and said, no, really, we should probably take a look at this. Turns out there was an MTU mismatch on another vendor's device that was sitting in the SD-WAN gateway. If you can pull all these different things together and start to correlate information when there's issues, it gives you a better position from which you can troubleshoot. Now that same idea, if Marvis is the underlying AI engine, and I know you said bot, and I'll make a slight distinction. It's not so much that it's a bot that sits on top and then just you interact with the bot the way we think of like chat bots. Think of it more as kind of a rules engine that we go through. We train it using data from the collective set of users that are all leveraging Mist in the cloud. If I can take that same thing and I can extend the collectors to different types of devices, then I can essentially apply the same AI engine. Now, of course, the workflows are going to be different. A lot of the how you handle remediation is going to be different. The things that you detect are different. So you don't get it for free. But the idea that AI engine then plugs into whatever your point of interaction is, whatever the point of control is, that's how I think these things come together. So if Mist represents a portfolio and Marvis represents a technology block, what I think we'll end up doing is using that as a backend service, and then plumbing that up into Apstra as the point of control, and then applying that in the context of Datacenter. Now, the nice thing about that, and just to kind of close this piece out, if we had to create essentially the collectors, the infrastructure required to get information from, say, our EX line of campus switches, understand that those all run Junos. And so a lot of the collection effort, a lot of the integration effort with the backend AI engine is already largely done. Like that stuff comes along, almost for free. Again, I don't want to understate the difficulty, like the data science part. Like anyone who knows anything about AI and ML will tell you that there's still a lot of work to go do. But a lot of the plumbing, we don't have to reinvent the plumbing, which is kind of nice. So that's how those things will come together. In the fullness of time, you can imagine, and here I'll wave my hands. This is hand wavy, right? In the fullness of time, you could start to think through what would an end-to-end story look like. But we've got a lot of work to do to get there. So I don't want to direct too much to the end-to-end pieces, but clearly we have to have a more than a 2-year point of view when we start looking at acquiring these big technology blocks.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So on the whole AI in the data center, because this was one topic we were hoping to kind of address in one of our recent podcasts, and we've talked about it in the past before. The concept of using AI ML to solve operational problems, and obviously that's where Mist seems to be weighted towards at the moment, towards kind of campus wireless. Do you think, because there's a few different aspects to this. There's one which is just a general blast radius problem, in that if you have some kind of AI or ML algorithm and it makes a bad decision in the context of an access point, you affect the users on that access point. And if you make that same decision in the context of, I don't know, a routing policy on a spine within a data center, the blast radius potentially is much larger. What kind of operations are you kind of foreseeing in general where we can apply AI in like a data center context, since that seems to be where Apstra fits into this? Sure.
So I'll lean a little bit on my intro. So I've worked in a lot of spaces early, and I've proven pretty definitively that even if I can be early on what the right bet is, I frequently get the timing wrong. Some of the issue in timing is that I think there's operational considerations I didn't fully appreciate until more recently in my career. When I was at Brocade, I ran data center at Brocade. We looked at AI, and the primary use case that really emerged was a security use case. Everybody wanted to know about, could we detect anomalous flows? And so we set out like, let's do anomalous flow detection because that seems like a really cool use case. Um, yeah, turns out I'm sure it's a great idea for somebody. It just was not a great idea for us, at least not at that time. Um, the amount of training data required to go and figure out an anomalous flow, in any network is ridiculous, right? There's all kinds of like logistical challenges just getting it, and forgetting that your flows will like what normal looks like will kind of change over time. And so how do you keep all that current? Like that is a pain. And then forgetting then you have like environment A and environment B, or customer A, customer B, customer C, and so on. Like that's going to be different. And so then how do you apply that? And how do the models applied? And like so I think the use cases that people were pursuing early in data center, I think they're not going to materialize, not because they're not valid use cases, but because the logistics around them are really, really hard. When you talk about the automated remediation, I don't think that's the first use case. I think gray failure detection is probably the first use case. It's like things that you might otherwise deduce by going through a set of like really practiced network engineering steps. If you can do that so that you don't have to go through that exercise, if the system can do it for you, then that gives you more information. Now, it might be that remediation is just take steps 1, 2, 3 after that. I don't know that you'll see automated remediation immediately, right? Because you have to develop trust with the operators as well. And then you mentioned the blast radius thing. I mean, the reason people don't change their networks very often is because when you change it, if you don't have the right sort of infrastructure in place to do dependency mapping, to do testing, then a change represents risk. I mean, we just came through the holidays. How many networks were
Yeah.
changing over the last 8 weeks, right? And it's like precisely zero, right? Unless you were running a university where everybody headed out, um, every other network changed ground to zero. So I just don't think you're going to get permission from the user base to go and do auto remediation. I think you're going to get hopefully slightly better done, but you'll get like Clippy will come up and I see I see this is happening in your network. Do you also want to take these steps?
Right.
I think that's probably where you start, frankly, and that'll be consistent with the amount of insights that you can get out of AI early on anyway. You don't start out on day one going after the hardest, the very, very hardest problems. I think you have to go after fairly simple things. If I had to guess, I think you're going to see broader adoption in wide scale networks because the operational load is higher there, and I think that the willingness to ingest different technologies are going to be higher anyway. And then if I look at larger networks, things like failing optics feels like a fairly straightforward use case to go after.
Right. So a lot of the kind of like trend line notice something going bad based on some kind of pattern matching being
Yeah.
a big use case. Do you think this extends to kind of crunching other data sets as well? I know, like if you look at how Microsoft tries and solves the gray failure problem with using probing and ping mesh and net bouncer, do you think that becomes part of this solution as well, where there's a decent amount of kind of probing happening in the data path and that's getting fed in as part of the data set, not just what we would typically think of as a control or management plane telemetry?
Yeah, for sure, right? So the way I think people view their infrastructure, and I think there's a little bit of a spectrum, but folks who are building infrastructure for other people, what they tend to do is, if you're on the kind of the most basic of those, say like a centralized IT in a large enterprise, you view your network as a collection of devices, each of which has things to manage, and it's got APIs and information that you might get. As you get more sophisticated and you start moving into maybe folks that more approximate cloud operations, it's no longer a set of devices, it's a set of components, right? And if you were to look in the far extreme where operations, they view everything as completely disaggregated, right? It's anything that generates any state, anything that can be queried, anything that can be modified, and so it's a collection of subsystems. If that's the case, then certainly the telemetry will have to extend beyond just normal network state, pulling out control plane stuff. I think what you're going to end up getting is massive amounts of data. What that leads to is initially is going to be a flood of stuff that you got to store. And if you don't really know what you're looking for, what people will do is they'll start keeping everything. And then that's going to lead to really practical decisions like, okay, well, if I shouldn't keep the things I don't need. So now let me start to make a reasoned decision about the things that I want. And so I think you'll see a little bit of a oscillation back and forth to, collecting some stuff, collecting everything, and then paring it back. And then, and I'll give you like one easy use case. This is from years ago, by the way. We're talking to a company that wanted to build out a different kind of cloud. And what they wanted to look at was optics failures. And again, this dates back, 6 years, because they realized that if they saw degrading optics, what they could do is instead of throttling or shunting traffic around a particular link, what they could do is throttle the applications. And so I don't think even remediation has to be a networking activity. It could be that you can push back, on the app side or on the user side. Because in their situation, what they didn't want to do was see either intermittent loss once they got beyond some threshold. So they knew they could drive it at, say, 60% up into a certain point and then shut it down and route around the link. Like these are, I don't think it's like infrastructure versus apps. It's going to be those two things coming together. But of course, the sophistication of that's going to depend highly on the type of customer it is. And so I do think that people that approximate, let's say Netflix style operations, like you're going to see much more traction there early on.
Yeah, I think there's a fine balance, and this thought comes from the conversation we had with the previous guest between collecting the amount of information you're collecting and collecting the right information. And it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem to some extent, in that you want to collect a lot of information because you want to detect things that you may not know about. But that's kind of the point of having AI detect things that you may not be aware of. But at the same time, you can't just go out and have a blanket collect all information, because you just simply can't scale that collection. The data
totally
set
right.
becomes too big, right? So I think there's probably a place to play there for whether it be vendors or open source solutions that provide you with a set of data. So using some of the tools you just mentioned, Bruce, to collect information, but then also have it more specific, and that for a given use case or a given type of topology or a given history of known issues, and in collecting the right type of information to be able to potentially detect these issues ahead of time. And I think the way we're heading with this whole AI thing is, we want to collect a lot of information. I just think we're going to have to be pretty specific, especially early on, about what kind of information you want to collect, so that we can detect the types of problems we want to detect, I guess.
Yeah, there's like a big, I mean, it always comes down to a big data problem, right? In that you need information to derive decisions, especially once you start thinking about proper AI and ML, where it's coming up with its own conclusions. It's not like you're going in there and saying once dB loss on a link is equal to this amount, that means the link is no longer good and you need to take some kind of action. The beauty of AI and ML is that you don't need to tell it that. It'll figure that out based on an input and an output, right? So it's like you said, there is this chicken and egg problem, because the way we try and solve network automation typically is we go, a human would solve these 10 problems a certain way. Let's automate those. And that's typically how we've solved network automation is, we have an order of operations we repeat to solve a control plane switchover, for example. So let's just automate and have a machine drive that. But the really cool thing with AI and ML is that you can just give a huge data set and train it based on 100,000 link failures based on dB loss, and it then knows, right? So
yeah, to some extent, although I would say that is true, but and I'm not an ML expert, so that's just like a disclaimer. But you do have to feed it, or you can train it. You do have to put some rules in place for it to understand some things. Like you do train the algorithm to some extent. Your starting point is one in which you may actually dictate that a specific dB loss is a failure. And that's maybe your starting point, and it may build off of that. But I think in general, they are the algorithm you select and what it's looking for, and you can start training a little bit. So they may be part of this may actually be figuring out which ML algorithms to use, and then where you start them off from, and that may dictate what they'll be able to pick up on and give you in terms of information you didn't know about.
Yeah, I think that the product becomes part product and part practice. So, and what you're really talking about is the emergence of data practices. What I think that companies that don't think about it will turn everything on because they don't know what they need, and the logistical nightmares and I mean, even things like storage. I mean, there's like real expense associated with collecting everything. Um,
Hmm.
so I think what you'll see is that they'll turn things on and then they'll pare it back. I think if you want to be thoughtful about how you get there, I would say target a use case, start really small, and then and ideally you pick the smallest use case imaginable, and then you tune what your collection looks like to that. I don't think it's going to be the case for most enterprises anyway, where they essentially unleash a bunch of algorithms to discover like everything that's possibly happening. I don't think that happens in practice.
Yeah,
And then
agreed.
the care and feeding of the models, like you said, if people can't answer the question, like how is this going to be modified over time? Like if those questions can't be answered up front, then I just think it probably means there's a little bit of AI washing and ML washing. Most people who say they have AI and ML today are usually talking about basic linear regression. Um, and that's it's not hard, and it doesn't mean it's not useful, by the way. But I do think, and kind of to the point about the automation piece, um, there's going to be a part of the market that's going to view AI as their ability to essentially leapfrog past the whole automation movement, and they're going to be sorely disappointed because if you don't have like automation practices already in place, it's going to be really hard to 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 assume that somebody's going to develop a system that's going to figure out how to operate your network that if you yourself can't operate it in a programmatic way. So I think you're going to see that the Gartner thing where it's like the what do they call it,
The
the trough
quadrant,
of
the quadrant.
oh no, the trough of disillusionment,
Oh,
right? They have
okay. You're right. Right.
the Gartner hype cycle, right? So you have like
Yeah.
I think what you're going to see is we're going to go, people are going to expect so much, and then they're going to get out the other end, and they're going to find out, well, man, it's a lot of work to get this to work, and we don't have the people, and we're still working off of mops and sops. I think once you kind of have that realization, then I think you'll start to see real progress. Hopefully, the vendors can figure some of the stuff out. Bootstrap people either with practices or services. Hopefully the products are going to be a bit mature enough to do some of that. But I don't think someone's going to ship like a piece of code that again,
Magically, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I don't see it.
Yeah.
I don't think operations move. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think in the history of our industry that there's been an install that all of a sudden upgrades your entire operational experience from whatever I won't call it legacy, but maybe heritage. So you have a heritage operating model, and then all of a sudden you have a cutting edge one. Like I tend not to see that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the way Rob Shakir kind of worded this, I thought was pretty nice, in that the current use cases you need to solve for are ones that you can solve through kind of simple automation practices. So that means don't collect everything from the system. Figure out what you need to collect to solve a problem you're trying to automate, and use those automations to build upon more complex automations. So kind of it's the classic web scale model, right? Break something into its kind of composable parts, simplify those parts, get them right, and then scale it up. And I think that's a pretty sound way to go these days, whether it come from a vendor provided solution that's giving you some kind of workflow management, or, other simple automations. The way we typically solve problems, things like gray failures, for example, at like a hyperscale scale, is by just literally turning things off or draining routers until you figure out where problems are, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Like if you're a smaller operator, just turning off a part of your network so you can debug a problem sounds like absolute madness. But when you operate at that scale, I mean, these kind of weird gray failures can be a real problem to solve. And that's why we've started to see a lot of innovations around like probing and like you were saying, ML and AI playing a bigger role here in crunching those data sets. But there's no silver bullet yet. I mean, Skynet is not here yet. We might get there, but we're definitely not there yet. So, all right, to segue a little bit, because I think we could sit here and talk about AI in the data center, in the network, the data sets we could talk about that forever. But a topic that Erwin and I toss around about a lot is, and we're using this as a poor segue into disaggregation, into Sonic, into open source, into all that good stuff. What are, I guess, Erwin, maybe you can start off with your thoughts on this space in terms of where Sonic is, in your opinion, of course, where it's being adopted, where it's not being adopted, and, we all work for vendors here. So what are some of the problems that we need to solve as vendors? Where are some of the opportunities? Where are we at? Maybe you give your thoughts first, Erwin, and then we'll let Mike give his.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, and I went on a bit of a rant about Sonic on the end of the Apstra acquisition podcast, but yeah, so I think there's a lot of hype around Sonic right now, and I know, Bruce, you and I had a conversation, I think it was yesterday, about this actually offline, with regards to what problem Sonic was trying to solve. So, we talked about solving the having a common set of data models across vendors or across hardware, and doing that at the data model layer, like Open Config. So we just finished a podcast with Rob on that. And then Sonic seemed to be coming at it from a different angle, which was not just solving the data model problem, but actually solving the whole, having a common operating system and a common set of operating the entire network and all of its devices commonly across different sets of hardware, right? So having a common operating system. And in this case, Microsoft was pushing for that approach, and they went and developed this operating system and open sourced it. And then it's gained some adoption. Obviously, Microsoft is using it. We're seeing it pop up more and more. I think there's a lot of hype around Sonic right now. I'm not, again, coming back to that rant I had, I'm not so sure that it's really ready for mainstream from an operations perspective. And again, putting my vendor hat on, a lot of the stuff that, the queries that I get from my set of customers about our own operating systems and the operations behind that and how to manage it, just simply, aren't there in Sonic today. So I think there's quite a big gap in what people expect Sonic to be as a network operating system and what Sonic actually is today. Now, where Sonic is going, so will Sonic, mature to the point where it can be more widely adopted? Tools like, this is, coming back to Apstra, tools like Apstra certainly kind of helped bring that along, but from a network operating perspective, it still has quite a few gaps with regards to operations and management. So, and then the last thing I'll finish on with Sonic and my ranting about Sonic is with regards to the whys and the whos are going to want to adopt Sonic. And so, there's this perception that, open source operating system allows me to go and select whatever white box hardware I want. So that gives me some leverage there. The operating system is essentially quote unquote free. So I should be getting some savings there. And so the perception may be that purchasing, your hardware from an edge core or another ODM, getting this free operating system from Sonic, you may be being further ahead than if you went through an integrated solution through a vendor. I actually don't really necessarily see that as being the case. I think that once you start dealing with things like Enterprise Sonic from Dell or EdgeCore and paying for that support, and then getting hardware from either of those vendors, that whole stack is looking awfully close to what a vendor is offering. And I would find it hard to believe that any of the major vendors would be losing out on an opportunity from a price perspective, competing against someone like a Dell plus Sonic, Enterprise Sonic, or an EdgeCore plus their version of Sonic. So yeah, I mean, again, a bit of a rant there, but that's kind of the big picture. I'm not too sure where to start off with and dig deeper into that topic. But
well, I think let's try and break that up a little bit, because there's this there's a lot there. I mean, you can try and digest that as it was, Mike, if you want. But I think if we break it up,
I could sit here and talk a while. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I think if we break it up into kind of the different parts, because there's obviously an entire Sonic angle to all of this, and that's probably worth us spending a bit of time on anyway. But I think there's a more general disaggregation story here, and the discussion of Sonic kind of comes as a byproduct of that. For me, there's always the why, like you said, Erwin, that why would you want to adopt disaggregation? And there's obviously a lot of opinions around that. Maybe let's start there on what is disaggregation trying to solve, and is it really going to solve it? To your point, Erwin, you're saying that one of the big motivators, of course, is choice, and a big motivator behind that choice is driving economics, right? And that you think if you can buy best of breed software, best of breed hardware, you end up with a cheaper overall TCO. And I don't necessarily know that's true. Same as you. I think once you factor in support and getting an enterprise grade version of software, whether it be free or from somebody else, and then getting hardware, and then someone has to pay to do that integration, that maybe it doesn't add up in terms of the price angle. So maybe what are your thoughts on that, Mike? Is there really a price angle to all of this? Is this another facade, or is there something real here?
Initially, disaggregation was certainly about price. The idea generally was, if you could stoke competition and you could create economic leverage, then components would drop. The gross margins in our space, tend to be, these are all publicly reported, usually they're mid 60s on the product side.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to look at servers, that number drops down quite a bit, depending on whether it's branded or unbranded servers, 40s or down to 20s. And if you're buying in volume, even lower than that. At some point, I think there was a hope that people could get hyperscale, essentially hyperscale economics by breaking everything apart. What they sort of ignored in all of that was that everything that gets broken apart has to be pulled back together. You two have both referenced the integration costs, and I think that that's spot on. The second piece is that there's just a capability and know-how that's required in order to do all that work. Usually what ends up happening, at least on the enterprise side, is that instead of the vendor doing the integration, you then pay like a low end, like a VAR or a distributor that acts as an SI.
Mm-hmm.
And so you still have to pay for that. It's not like it comes for free. It's just you're paying somebody else for it. Maybe they have a different margin threshold, so they'll accept fewer dollars. When I was at Brocade, we created a white box, what ended up being like a white box SD-WAN gateway. The challenge even with that was that we had two reference designs. The BIOS was slightly different, and so we had different behavior, even though they both met the reference architecture. I just think the operational implications are pretty big. The bigger question is does disaggregation do enough to break the economics? There, I think it's still kind of undecided. I think at certain scale. So certainly what Amazon has done quite famously. They did it, but keep in mind that they basically destroyed Cumulus en route to what they did. So were the economics so much better because everything was disaggregated, or were the economics better because they negotiated an awesome deal and it ultimately it didn't drive commercial success on the other end? Like I think you need some insiders to answer that question for you, but I think it's a question worth asking.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think what you're going to see is disaggregation generally it'll be more prevalent, especially as some of the large hyperscalers start to ship what they do, so the enterprises consume from them, they become a channel. And so I think it becomes more prevalent. I think you ignore disaggregation at your peril. But do I think that we're like a year or 2 years away from like widespread adoption in enterprises? I don't think that's the case. What I see now is some of the what I would call cloud majors, the tranche of customers that sit below the hyperscalers. There's a lot of interest there. And I think ultimately what we're going to have to answer as an industry, and this is all of us, is whether that's if really what we want is economic advantage, is this going to be the primary lever to get it? And at some point you have to look at the concentration of profit dollars across the different components that make up a network. And if you think it's the OS and you want to break that apart, I think then that gives you one answer. If you think that there's other areas where margin dollars are going to accrue, then you might look there as well. And so I think there's going to be, at least in the short to midterm, there's going to be probably higher value targets to go after. And certainly this is what like Nick McCune and the whole P4 movement were originally trying to do. So I don't know. I think we're going to end up in a model that kind of splits. And then it's anybody's guess, kind of who the emergent winners are going to be when that happens.
Yeah, I mean, this really could go, I guess, any direction. I'm sure there was a lot of hope from maybe some of those cloud majors or hyperscalers that you refer to, that maybe vendors would be more on board with some of this. Some vendors are on board in varying degrees of commitment with this whole disaggregation movement, offering white box models to at least some degree. So there's at least some industry following here. We know who it's being driven by, of course. In the same way that every industry has their cash cows, ours does too, and they tend to drive the industry in general. We talked with Rob Shakir last week around some of the gRPC management stuff, some of the open config stuff, and that being solved at different layers. And that really wouldn't happen without those kind of cloud titans driving that stuff. I do wonder if, the reason the economics work for someone like Google or Amazon to go and, buy directly from an ODM and build their own software stack, or buy someone else's software stack, is that they're doing it at such a high scale that they can negotiate out a lot of those margin dollars. Who else is doing that, really? I mean, I don't know of anyone that is really buying at that kind of volume. And it almost feels like, and Erwin and I were talking about this yesterday, that we're almost coming back to the ODMs becoming a vendor. Like EdgeCore has their own enterprise version of Sonic now. Now, it happens to be open source, sure, but that's a vertically integrated solution from an ODM. I mean, haven't we come full circle? Go. Yeah, haven't we come full circle? That's where things are going to go. So that just seems like craziness.
Yeah, so I think what ultimately what's going to happen there, look, as I mentioned, I think you ignore disaggregation, at your peril. The thing that we were joking about before we started recording is that it's pretty straightforward to figure out what's going to happen. The real magic isn't knowing what's going to happen. The real magic is knowing when it's going to happen. And I'll ignore the diatribe on that. There's a strategy piece there, and I think that in general the world has most of it wrong. If we don't know when it's going to happen, then what'll happen? What I think ends up being the case is that every major supplier is going to build their products in a disaggregated way, and then so Juniper, right? We've been shipping white box stuff for a decade. We're waiting for the commercial demand to show up, right? Like there's not like giant commercial demand, and if it's there, then the thing that changes is the business model. That's actually harder to change than the technology. I think most people have architected their products in a way that you've got clean boundaries. You can separate things out. I think you talked about in the Apstra, in the previous Apstra podcast, the notion of containerized routing, so CRPD, which is our routing stack on a container. We've got the ability to pull that out, because if everything gets disaggregated, then the question is what are the high value pieces? And it turns out that we have a high value component in our routing stack, and maybe that's the thing that you go and drive business around, right? I think everyone's going to have that kind of thing, but the question is going to be, who acts as the integrator, and then eventually, again, where do you think where are the margin dollars going to accrue? Now, you said that you're very polite. You're probably more polite than my PR people would allow me to be, but if you look at so Broadcom has a stranglehold on silicon, and if you were to look at their overall operating margins, their operating margins, not their product margins, their operating margins for that part of the business are 3, 4, 5x what a normal company in this space has. At some point we have to ask questions. What happens to trends like silicon diversity, even like optics as a component of overall cost in the data center. It's no longer just like the OS. It's not about like, I'm going to save myself a few extra dollars on this. There's going to be a reckoning, I think, in the industry at some point, led by the cloud titans, right? They're gonna lead that, because they've got huge economics that are built into it. And when that happens, I think what it does is it opens up a lot of opportunity. The question is going to be, to what extent, if any, does that come down market, right? Do we see enterprises, even service providers, essentially participating in the same game? And then to what extent does value accrue when you're building out at lower volume? And in order to participate in that value, I just think your practices have to change. It's not just about buying different products. Your refresh cycles. If an enterprise refresh cycle is, let's say on the order of 5 to 7 years, what happens if in order to participate, your refresh cycle has to be 2 to 3 years. Like, there's just a lot more that goes into it. And I think there's a fairly incomplete view in the market. And so when I hear conversations about it, I always smile, because I think it's great that everyone's interested. I just think there's a lot of practical realities that tend to get swept under the rug. disaggregate everything. That's fine. I don't know how you like the operations piece has to come along. I think in both of you mentioned the word operations. I think we have to watch that how that emerges, especially in companies that aren't, Amazon, that aren't Microsoft, that aren't Google, Facebook, whoever.
So I guess maybe the question to both of you then. So where do you see specifically the software piece in that? Because I mean, I went on my Sonic rant, but what's the, as Mike, you rightfully pointed out, it's figuring out where the margins are that you want to try and rein in, and where you can make some of these savings with disaggregating. I'm not seeing it on the Sonic front personally. I'm not too sure that the driver for Microsoft to develop Sonic was really just like a financial cost of the actual vendor operating system itself, and it lended itself more to their operational model and their ability to have control over it. So then, if we talk disaggregation in our space, where does the software play a part in it, and does Sonic really have a space outside of the hyperscalers and the Microsofts of this world?
I think Sonic will climb down market. I mean, we see enough interest. Whether the value accrues, I think, is sort of separate. But I think that you'll see. I think you'll see it move down market. I don't have a sense for how far down market. I think I tend to think about the market less as classes of customers and more of like types of operations. So if you operate, if IT is part of your supply chain, meaning if you lower your cost of networking, you increase your margins for your service, I think you behave one way. If IT is an enabler, it's not part of the supply chain, it's merely an enabler for some other part of the business, then you treat it differently. It's more about how easy can you make it. And so I think there's really a bifurcation based on the role that IT plays. In the sides where IT is part of the supply chain, I think Sonic will become more prevalent. I think as it does, we're going to learn a lot about Sonic. Right now, if you're Sonic for fixed form factor is sort of one beast, and Sonic for say modular chassis is handled differently. The operational burden on modular chassis is pretty I
Massive.
won't say ridiculous. Yeah, right.
Massive.
Treating each line card as its own entity, you're no longer managing a device. You're managing 8 or 12 or however many line cards you have. So I think there's going to be operational changes even in Sonic as this emerges, and then that's going to then lead to architectural decisions about whether you're it's essentially how you're building out your spine layer effectively. So I think there'll be changes in how Sonic evolves, similar to what I started with. My guess is if I think Sonic's going to be relevant, let's say starting now and really picking up over the next 2 years, I'm off by like a factor of 3 or 4. So maybe so what that tells me, and in the face of, if you look at macroeconomic conditions, like adoption and migration slow down when everything tightens up. And so, maybe it won't move down market as fast as a lot of us, think. And then the question then is going to be, when's the right time to really go in and push? I think what you see now, and this is kind of the strategy side, is if I know that disaggregation is real, and I don't think anybody should, if you're dismissive of the disaggregation trend generally, I just I would question anybody who kind of stands back and says, this isn't, get off my lawn, it's not happening to me. I think that trend is real. Then the question is, what's the rate of investment in order to capitalize on that when it hits? And my suspicion is if you invest a little bit now, you can treat it like a slow burn, and essentially be ready whenever the commercial demand materializes. So what I think the vendors will do is largely prepare using Microsoft as the internal justification for everything, right? Like, let's go take a big chunk of that business. Everybody wants to go, play in the largest accounts. So I think it's fine to go do that. And then what'll happen is that if you kind of participate in that slow burn, then when the commercial demand materializes, you're in a position that you've already invested in it. The companies that don't, the companies that ignore it, I think what happens is that they're gonna, when the demand does materialize, you're gonna be in a position where you have to do it quickly. And I think the business model changes are substantial. Getting to something that's different fast, I think that's hard, and that's where you make like really big execution problems. So I, for one, am actually fairly encouraged by the disaggregation discussion. I think that it's happening at mostly the right pace. I think it's allowing companies to move kind of in lockstep, which I think is a positive. Um, because I think you break the industry if only one company if only one supplier gets to an answer and no one else is there, like all the economic advantage that you're looking for, it doesn't exist because all of a sudden you have one company. So if we all kind of march together, I think what you'll tend to see is the economics will actually materialize a bit more faithfully than they have it with other buzzwords. Um, so I would say I'm bullish on it happening. I'm bearish on it really impacting the market over the next, let's say 18 months. Like I think that just seems unlikely to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess people tend to just compare the networking industry to kind of the generalized compute industry and almost just assume that the two are equal. And, in some degrees they are. I think in a lot they're not. Like we tend to function more as appliances rather than applications. And so there's this mind shift that I think needs to occur. And maybe it's starting to. Like you put out, and Erwin and I have talked about this before as well, that there's often many ways to solve a problem and many layers or levels at which to solve it. There's the normalization problem. Going back to the Apstra acquisition, doing this at kind of a northbound interface. There's the open config movement trying to do this on the box. There's some hardware normalization like P4 that are trying to do this even lower level. I wonder if we're going to start to see that, or maybe we already are seeing that on this whole disaggregation trend where, right now we have ODMs. We have kind of software suppliers that are bundling their software. Some of those are free, some of them aren't. And then we have kind of the application ecosystem that maybe is going to ride on top of that as another level of disaggregation. The challenge I've always seen with this is that typically where disaggregation is strong today is in fairly simple use cases. So the complexity of having a well-performing software stack in any condition under the sun doesn't matter as much as it would in a lot of the other use cases. We tend to throw complex protocols at problems. I know, at least I've definitely seen that trend where and I guess it's the simple way to approach a problem, right? When you have a new solution, you try to fit it where it's solving relatively simple problems at first, and then you kind of scale it up from there. So we're definitely seeing that, and in hyperscalers, of course, Sonic is quite prevalent. We talked about Microsoft. We know others are looking at it or are deploying versions of it or taking pieces of it, whether it be Psi or some of the other components of Sonic. Whether or not it makes it down market, to your point, Mike, I don't know. The conversation I always end up having to myself and to others is around, think of like the last RFP you responded to, and think about the list of requirements that were on that RFP, and now think about how many of those requirements an operating system like Sonic meets today. And it's not very many. It's not very many.
I can tell you from a very, very recent RFP. I mean, this was kind of my point earlier, was that it doesn't check many of the boxes, especially when it comes down to operations and management yet. And that's not to say it's not going to. Certainly it can, but today it doesn't. So I guess the when question is very relevant here as to when it gets adopted downstream, and if it does, because again, it comes back a little bit still to the value it provides, right? And I don't think the value and that it provides is really a monetary one. So, I'm not seeing it personally. I'm not seeing the downstream adoption as being certainly very, very soon. I think right as we're speaking, there's a lot of hype around it. I predict that the hype will die down a little bit, and there may be adoption downstream, and it's just going to take longer than what people think. I think that as people start pocking it, they start playing with it now, they'll come to the realization that it doesn't check those RFP boxes that they're sending to their vendors today in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think on the enterprise side, I call it the derivative RFP. So you issue a new RFP, you open your old RFP, you add one line to it, Sonic, and so now you have exactly 1,001 requirements. I think in cases like that, I think it's not that it has marginal value; it'll have no value in cases like that for the foreseeable future. I think for the folks who view it as an operational change, which is really like that, and that's where the action is going to be. Then I think you'll have, and again, that's going to be on the companies where where the infrastructure is their product. I think you'll see adoption and deployment there. The general question, well, just one quick thing though, the general question is going to be if the you should have a point of view that says here's the value I expect to accrue, and then you should have a separate point of view that says this is the fastest path to get to whatever value I'm trying to get. And if all you want is economic leverage, then there might be other things you can do that are far easier than trying to like re-architect everything and changing your procurement process and everything else. So I think that reckoning has to happen. And I think in the enterprises that'll lead to kind of one set of answers, and I think in SaaS and cloud type companies that'll lead to a different set of answers. What I hope is that people ask the right questions, because pursuing like big architectural stuff because it's buzzworthy. Like I'm not saying that you'll end up getting OpenStacked, but that's because I don't have.
Is that an adjective now? Are we allowed to do that?
Now it is, apparently. Mike has coined it. But hold on a second. I was going to say, so what is that operational value that you see those who are using IT as part of their core business and now they can start leveraging Sonic? And what is the actual operational value that they're seeing? And I'll preface that with, in something like Microsoft, you can envision that, if they have a core business where they're doing software and they have an army of software engineers and their ability to then manage their own software stack, and if there were to be issues, they can probably fix it faster than opening a ticket with your local TAC and having the vendor go through their 6-month cycle of getting a software release out to you. There's value to them, right? Where is that value for the smaller guys, but who are still their business driver is IT? Where do you see Sonic even providing value there from an operations standpoint?
It depends on the two things, right? What's the scale of the data centers that you're talking about? And then you can even go like all the way back and say like, what's the value of automation in an environment that's small enough? You're actually fine just being a CLI jockey. So I think there's an element of scale, and then I think from an operations perspective, the extent to which you want to abstract out the operations from the underlying devices, if that gives you some economic leverage within those platforms, that makes sense. That economic leverage will increase as the number of switches that you purchase in any given procurement timeline like that. So I think it's going to go with volume of new purchases, and then to some extent tied to your refresh cycle. I think that's where it's going to be. I think that's going to be, with it from a market perspective, that's going to really, at least in the short to medium term, I think, again, cloud majors and SaaS companies that have, either heavy DevOps shops or heavy like software engineering as part of their operations team. I think that's where you play. I don't think that you're going to get, I don't think you get a whole lot of value if you're managing a bunch of switches and you've turned on a bunch of like esoteric, nerd knobs that you're using. I think what the cloud companies have taught us is that if they simplify the architecture, they can do a lot more stuff. That's why I don't think it's just simple use cases. I think it's actually that's by design. I don't think it's just that you have an entry point. What they've tried to do is say, let me get the underlying infrastructure as simple as possible, so that if I have a software issue, I don't even troubleshoot it. I literally just RMA the box. If it's a software bug, I pull it out. That operating model is very different than what like an enterprise goes through. I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but I was going to say, it seems like from what you're suggesting they were talking about, it seems like you see value in normalizing the operations in having this common operating system, and then being able to potentially at some scale leverage economics of having different hardware selection that software that normalized software layer can operate on. So I guess, this comes down to a little bit to where do you do that normalization when it comes down to network operating systems, and whether there's value in normalizing the actual operating system itself versus normalizing your automation tool stack by having a common data model set and a common set of tools that can extract data from it in a normalized way, and so on and so forth. Like where that normalization should happen. I'm personally not so sure that normalizing the operating system software stack itself in its entirety will really get you that much from a gaining standpoint. But yeah, maybe I'm not sure. Yeah, well, the market hasn't decided yet, right? If the market had decided,
I'm guessing we're pie in the sky trying to talk about this. But yeah, you're right. The market hasn't decided.
if the market had decided, we wouldn't. When you hear Sonic, I mean, count the number of words before you hear Microsoft, right? What's
No,
the average?
exactly.
About
Yeah,
four and a half words, something like that.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think people have decided, right? I mean, Amazon has their own ambitions around DIY, whatever, and we've seen other companies, Facebook obviously with some of the OCP work that they did, they had ambitions. Things haven't really materialized the way a lot of those early projects, were designed. I don't think they didn't Facebook. I mean, I remember where I was when the OCP stuff was coming out. I mean, everyone was talking about wrecking the networking industry. That didn't really happen.
Yeah.
That's not to say there wasn't value in standardizing on a smaller set of form factors. It makes perfect sense. I just don't think that I don't think everyone's decided architecturally what they're going to do. I mean, even basic stuff, right? Like the stuff that I mean, the whole discussion of the 5-stage and super spine and butterfly topologies and I mean, like that didn't. You haven't. It took like 8, 9, 10 years to get even consensus on like what I would think of as fairly foundational elements. I don't think that the industry is going to say in one voice, I'm going to put everything on Sonic. I think what you're going to see is that some people will follow because we've got a little bit of like, a little bit of cultish behavior. So there'll be a cult of Amazon and there'll be a cult of Microsoft, and there's probably a different cult of Google and whoever else, right? And then you'll get people that follow. What'll end up happening, I think, is that it's going to force the suppliers to participate in all of those things, right? They'll make decisions about where they want to bet. Most of us, part of strategy, it's really hard to say no to anything, and so most of us sort of place bets on everything. And the result of that is going to be that you're going to see a little bit of a fractured marketplace for a while. And then as commercial demand materializes, then I think people will press their bets a bit in those areas. I don't see it for a while. The types of things that might accelerate it, by the way, if COVID accelerates the move to cloud and you start seeing like massive chunks of that market, essentially the buying proxy ends up being the hyperscalers. Like if that happens, then you'll see massive share shift, and maybe that accelerates something one way or another. But failing that, I actually don't think that you're going to see an acceleration here. Which again, not to be a broken record, but if you want to be good at strategy, it's not enough to know what's going to happen. You have to be able to say fairly precisely when. And my crystal ball is empty. Like I don't see it.
No idea. Agreed. Same.
Yeah.
But if we could figure it out though, if there's like a listener that has a crystal ball that's not empty, like just email me.
Chime in.
Just let us know when we should invest in this Sonic bandwagon and when we should jump on full force.
Exactly.
And are we too late? I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. Speaking of some of like the forward-looking crystal ball stuff, I wanted to pick your brain on some of kind of the hardware side. We've focused on software a lot so far. So just some initial thoughts on hardware. I guess we'll focus on data center because that's kind of all of our expertise here. Where it's heading. I mean, you mentioned the elephant in the room, which is kind of the fact that Broadcom has a massive monopoly on this market in particular. I mean, there's branching out into other markets, but certainly it seems to have mostly monopolized data center switching. There's competition out there, of course. There's some other merchant silicon players that don't seem to have gotten too much traction. And I think this goes to show people's appetite for risk in this market. Because in a lot of cases, they're not getting discounted based on power or speeds and fees or anything like that. They're getting discounted based on ability to deliver in a timely manner in the current climate that we are in. And that chip actually working and not having to be respun and things like that. So I guess, and maybe this links into some of the more future-looking, 3 challenges facing data center operator stuff, which I'm sure we'll get to near the tail end. But where's your head at in terms of where data center hardware is, both on the switching side, and then I guess there's this evolution at the moment towards driving more networking functions inside the compute. We've been doing that for a long time. We've been doing that with overlays for a while. And there's now this movement with SmartNICs and driving some of those functions, not necessarily in software on the compute, but closer to hardware. So maybe that plays into some of this as well. What should we be looking out for on hardware in data centers today, tomorrow, next year? What's kind of your gut feel here, Mike?
Um, so I think where the margin dollars accrue right now, I mean, it's no surprise to anybody who purchases data center equipment. I think you see inside your white box is a really big black box, and Broadcom certainly commands a good chunk of that.
Hmm.
I think optics. So right now, I think what the industry needs is either new solutions in optics, which is some of the stuff happening around silicon photonics, and I think there's a bunch of different bets that have been placed.
Yep.
On the silicon side, I had rooted for Cavium. I really wanted Expliant to take off. It didn't. That was unfortunate. Um, Obviously, you've got the Intel is with the acquisition of Barefoot. They're going to do what they're going to do, which was originally kind of an open flow optimized piece of network silicon. I'm sure they would describe it differently, but if you kind of look at what the different blocks that they had built out, I think Innovium is in this space, and they look like maybe they're the next thing to kind of go after the top of rack side. So maybe you can go in and they're, clearly if you're going to go and compete with Broadcom, the thing that you're going to compete with is going to be on the pricing side, right? That's going to be the obvious thing. It actually creates a really interesting strategic dilemma. I know maybe not everyone cares about this stuff, but like if you're Broadcom and you own, a virtual monopoly of something, do you reduce your pricing when you see threats? Now, the answer from the outside is usually, well, like obviously that's what you would do. But if the threat is small, then if you reduce your pricing and that gets reset across the entire market, then you could actually really screw yourself in the short term. And so it's not as obvious. And I'll give you like an example. Everyone in our industry believes they know what they would have done if they were Cisco and Arista was emerging. Everyone talks like it was like an obvious thing to do. And maybe in hindsight, there's elements that are obvious. But I actually think it's a little bit more nuanced. If you're Cisco, do you reduce your pricing early to essentially kill off Arista when Arista was going in on essentially a pricing advantage and reduce your margins everywhere else in the business, or do you let them stay? Now, in hindsight, okay, they got breakout velocity and it created problems, but I don't think it's actually as obvious in the moment as people think. I think with Broadcom, it's going to be the same way. If somebody comes in and competes on price, then do they drop right away and effectively reset margins for the entire industry now, or do they wait? And what's the point at which you have to take action? And can you wall garden it around particular accounts or types of equipment? I just think it's not obvious. What I do think will happen is a couple of things, right? So I think what Broadcom's done with their SDK, you mentioned the word open before. Whether it's open or not, it's the de facto standard, which has the same properties of open for most. So do they compete with their SDK and people essentially plugging their development teams into that? Like, does that become a competitive mode? That's an interesting thing to look at. Clearly, you talked about edge core and you talked about the ODMs becoming full vendors. And clearly, what Broadcom has tried to do, what they want to do is sell their own stuff because they can essentially participate in the markup on the back end, and that would give them a perpetual pricing advantage if it goes that way. By the way, so I think you could see that. So all of these things, I think it turns out that you ask a hardware question. I think the hardware future is going to be determined by a bunch of software constructs, and I think generally it's going to be a question: Does Broadcom kill any silicon diversity? Do they kill it off just because they change their own pricing, or do you see a couple of like a duopoly emerge, or something like we had Cisco and the Seven Dwarves? Like, do you see something like that emerge? I think that's the question. And then and then the other players we have to pay attention to, right? So obviously Mellanox, with what they've
Spectrum.
done,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, and then they've got the Cumulus stuff now, and so do we what happens there, right? So does the Cumulus become the offering? If Cumulus was really the business case was primarily on the Amazon stuff initially, with JR going to Amazon, like what does Amazon do? I think it's going to be pretty complicated for the next couple of years, and the bets that people place. I mean, essentially, it's going to be a little bit Games of Thrones-ish, right? You're going to see it's not going to be obvious who's going to emerge, and the challenge strategically is who do you back? because I
Yeah.
don't think you're not going to be able to back everybody. And so people are going to have to make some decisions. It could be that this is one of those moments, and this moment may play out over many years. I don't mean like in the next 3 months, but this could be one of those moments that actually like meaningfully cleaves off a part of the market. I
Mm.
mean, the stakes are high. It's actually
Yeah.
exciting, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on the hardware front, there's a lot of competition these days. Like you said, I mean, everyone you pointed out. There's others that are smaller, maybe trying to hit other markets. There's some of the Chinese manufacturers as well. So there's a lot going on. Vendors are still building their own chipsets, of course. Some of those are coming. Well, they're trying to compete more head on with something like a Trident or a Tomahawk, as opposed to the old adage of vendors mainly focusing on kind of the complex WAN style use cases. We have chipsets now that are more focused on kind of lightly buffered, Tor or spine style functions. So there's a lot of competition. I'd agree that I don't think there's any obvious answers in terms of how this shakes out. There's obviously a lot of concern from the entire industry that Broadcom has a decent monopoly, and that's not good for anybody. If anyone can meaningfully challenge them, I don't know. I haven't seen it yet, I will say.
Well,
I think the
it'll be
NVIDIA
Cisco.
Yeah, it was
with Silicon One.
Silicon
Yeah.
One, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's because they have, so if you have a certain amount of market share, then what they could do is they could, effectively cleave a big chunk of market share off. Now, if that changes the economics for Broadcom, what that does is it actually, Broadcom's response is interesting, right? Do they essentially price compete to try to get Cisco back, or do they just raise the price and then pull margin dollars out of everybody else? If that happens, does that create a perpetual pricing advantage over everybody else? I mean, like these are like the strategies here are very, very interesting. What does AMD do? I mean, if Intel has kind of a play, does AMD, essentially, do they get in? You mentioned the Broadcom or the Trident and Tomahawk class. Obviously we've got the Jericho class as well. So what happens with like in those PE boxes, right? And it turns out, I mean, Arista came out. They initially said they were going to do to the WAN what they did to data center, and that didn't materialize because everybody had seen the play before. Once you've seen the play, you're like, oh, now I know what to do. And so everyone, kind of adjusted either their roadmaps or their pricing to head that off. And then now you see people pushing that same battle, pushing it into the campus as well. It could be that the data center fortunes, the data center hardware fortunes might be settled by software.
Mm.
And it might also be settled by moves that are made outside data center, like over the WAN and even in campus and branch. I think what you get is it's a full, it's a full playing field. It's not just data center anymore. And I think that the companies that make decisions only on data center, whether that's on the buying side or on the building side, I think companies that view it as data center only are going to miss some pretty big strategic elements. And again, the stakes are high, not just for the suppliers, right? Because when you go and you make purchase decisions, I mean, the stakes are going to be high for you as well, because your operations end up getting married. I mean, that if you don't think those operations plumb all the way down to whatever the underlying SDK is, I mean, you might not know it, but your operations are impacted by that stuff.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's gonna, in my mind, that's gonna play out. And I think there's gonna be clear winners and losers. I think in our industry has been a little bit boring for the last 10 years. There haven't been the winners and losers that you would normally see. I actually think over the next 10 years, you're gonna see companies go away. Like, I mean, like big companies. I don't mean like the startups that fail. I mean, I think you're gonna see like real cost of not having managed this well.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we'll see. I mean, EJ, did you have any other thoughts on hardware that you wanted to chime in?
Not really. No, I think you guys touched on all the topics. I had no extra value to add there.
The SmartNIC thing is the only piece that people need to pay attention to. I won't say anything intelligent about SmartNICs, but I will say that some of the work that's coming out of the SmartNIC vendors is actually pretty impressive. Like some of the things they're trying to do are cool. The question for me is going to be what's networking's role. If we just extend, essentially policy and control out to the SmartNIC, then it looks like a variant of like an overlay play. And if that's all that happens for security type use cases, then that's one thing. If other killer use cases emerge, I think that's interesting.
Mm.
But I do like SmartNICs generally. I think it's what I'm waiting for though is what's the killer app going to be, and generally like we infrastructure people, we try to project the killer app into the market, like, but I think we generally don't, we don't usually know. So
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, the obvious use case is, I mean, anything that requires some level of performance or some level of hardware acceleration. I think RDMA was the start of something that I think is going to end up hinging on SmartNIC in the pretty short term. I mean, it kind of already does. The changes to driving things using NVMe over fabrics versus things like Rocky. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. Like you said, I don't know what the killer app is going to be, whether it's going to be those storage use cases or just general shipping memory around. The whole DPU market's taking off. All of that relies on the network being able to send stuff without losing it. So there's an interop story here between the SmartNIC and the network playing nicely. I think there's a policy distribution thing that could happen here as well. I mean, the TCAMs on top of racks are typically
yep.
fairly limited. So, I mean, there's so many ways the whole SmartNIC thing could go. There's also the economics of the SmartNIC itself, in that they're actually really expensive right now. Like, unless you have that killer app, you're not going to buy the SmartNIC. So there's also like a chicken and egg thing going on. I don't know. I tend to agree that there's a play here. I mean, there's a lot of different plays here, in fact. I don't know what is really going to take off. I also don't know if the SmartNIC is going to end up becoming an extension of the network or an extension of the compute. Because, typically all those inside the compute functions have been an extension of the compute, and that's why there's all these wars around where overlays start, where they end, who owns them. Is it the IT guys? Is it the network guys? I mean, maybe we're over some of that now. Those are problems that our industry's been facing for a long time. So I have to assume some of them are going away. I wonder if SmartNICs is going to reintroduce them all over again.
I'd be interested to see what NVIDIA ends up doing, right? I mean, we talked about it in our NVIDIA podcast, but with what they've done with purchasing, the SmartNIC side, the top of rack side, Cumulus, like, they obviously have something in mind. And I'm really curious as to what they're going to come out with that does that whole integration piece, and whether they have that killer app ready to go, and then they're going to make some splash there with that. With regards to the whole policy distribution use case, I found it interesting that recently I read an article that Broadcom had released a TD4 Smart Tor variant, where basically with larger scale numbers for ACLs and that sort of stuff for the Tor, to address some of that, bring back the security policies and the Tor type functionality. And I'm not too sure if that's in response to SmartNICs or if they actually had some separate use case for it. I didn't quite understand. I should have spent more time looking into it, to be honest. But I do remember reading that article where they did talk about this TD4 variant that was like a smart Tor to have higher scale. But yeah, on the SmartNIC side, yeah, I don't know. I have nothing else to add. Killer app, waiting for it to show up. And I agree, Bruce, that the economics right now seem to not favor the SmartNIC until that killer app comes out.
There's a lot of people smarter than I that put a lot of money into it, so I'm really anxious to see who
Yeah,
wins.
exactly. Yep, agreed.
Yeah.
Fungible, Pensando, like there's just some big.
There's a lot. Yeah,
There's a lot,
Yeah, so again, my crystal ball is empty. I need a new crystal ball, basically.
You
Same.
do. Yeah, we all do. We'd all be a lot richer if we had one of those.
Absolutely.
All right. Maybe we can finish with the general question. We're trying to come up with a question that we ask everyone we bring on the podcast. And we are trying to keep it as general as possible, knowing that we're going to bring on a wide range of people throughout the famous history of the Networking podcast. So, what do you think are the three top challenges facing data center networks, operators, users? You can take your own spin on this as you see fit. Over the next 5 to 10 years, maybe a lot of it is stuff we've just previously talked about. But is there any other points you want to bring up, Mike?
Yeah, I won't relitigate the same thing. If you point out the general trend of what we've talked about, it's that the actions moved into operations. I always tell people that we've moved beyond building better networks, and we're moving now to making networking better. Networks are nouns defined by the sheet metal, the protocols, whatever. Networking is a verb. It's the people, the process, like all the softer side of things. I think that migration, that shift to operations is going to be huge, primarily because if you look, especially for enterprise, ignore the cloud scale because I think they don't need my help evolving. Um, on the enterprise side, though, I think that the gap between the promise of networking and the actual on the ground reality has never been wider. And I think that, and this is to some extent, this is like why your podcast exists. This is why you have things like Network Field Day. This is why you have so many outlets. Is that you're trying to bring clarity to a really confusing set of topics. And the problem is that it's not just that the topics are already broad, right? AI, SDN, disaggregation, cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. I mean, like just all this stuff. And then the rate of introduction of new topics is accelerating.
Mm.
I don't know how, if you're an operator, like how do you, when the gap between what you're promised and what you have becomes insurmountably large, you don't know how to move forward. And I think that's the white space to be solved. I mean, personally, that's why I like, that's one of the reasons I even reached out to you all, because I think there's real value in having like just a candid conversation. And candid can mean, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. I think that dwarfs every other problem. Most people even take SDN, right? Most people view SDN as the existence of a centralized control. All you've done is taken the CLI and instead of executing it on a bunch of devices, you implement it in a controller, and then the controller then pushes it out. Fundamentally, the control question is, job to be done. I think what the transition that we have to get through is what's the decision to be made. And fundamentally, if you're designing for decision to be made, I just think that's a very different thing to grapple with. And I don't know how operators get there if everything they're doing today is around, let me eke out a little bit more efficiency out of the way I do things today. Companies that can do that, whether it's like a network to code as an example, or whether it's some of these large SIs or these boutique VARs that focus on that, or whether it's some of the supply side, like the folks on the vendor side, the companies that can help navigate that transition and do it well, I think that's going to be who wins going forward. And that means that the big change is going to be not just rethinking from job to be done to decision to be made, but also how do you evaluate the right architectures for that? How do you hire the right people? How do you train up your staff with the right set of skills? What peripheral tools do you need outside of just the sheet metal and the big box stuff? And then how does that impact your buying decisions, your buying criteria? Like I think it's going to be a tumultuous say 5 to 7 years or so. And then that'll be, once we get there, then the next wave will be what happens with the cloud providers pushing all their stuff as the primary means of consuming infrastructure. But I think it's actually a pretty exciting time. As I mentioned, I think the stakes are high, and frankly, I'm interested because when the stakes are high, that's when their decisions actually matter. And when the decisions matter, I think that's when you actually see the rewards or the failures, by the way.
Failures, yeah. The other side of it, yeah.
But the key, and I gave you this advice before we started, the key is what you want to do is take the decision, and then you want to move on before the decision lands. So that's my free PSA to you all.
Yeah, it was a good piece of advice.
Make big decisions and then bail before they go bad.
Exactly.
Transition. That's how I can tell you. When you're an executive, you speak differently. You transition. You don't bail.
I got you.
Of course.
No, that's some good advice. So one final question. And we've talked about SDN. You just mentioned that quite a bit. Erwin and I like to throw stones at intent, not because it doesn't mean something real, but because it's mostly been market washed to the point that it has no real meaning. It's just the answer to everything. What is after intent? Is there something after intent in your opinion? What is the next buzzword our industry is going to go through? And what stocks should I invest in to make sure that I hit it?
So we just acquired arguably the creators of the whole intent-based movement. So I will say nothing bad about intent. It's amazing, and it's whatever. Everybody should do it. Um, in terms of what happens next, so if you believe that the AI and ML bits like really start to make headroads into the data center side, then and then you expect the data center is not going to be bounded by your four walls, so you extend out to whatever the edges happen to be. Then I think multi-domain monitoring, observability, like all of that whole trend of having to know what's happening, like that's obviously the next piece that comes up. We spent quite a bit of time talking about what do your data practices look like, and what do you keep and not keep. But there's going to be companies that will emerge there. You'll see the merging of operations between networking and kind of the workload lifecycle management tools. Obviously, everyone's integrating with Kubernetes on the kind of on the application side. Service mesh and all of that stuff. So like there's going to be continued emphasis there. I'll fall back to the thing I've said 3 or 4 times today, though. It's not obvious to me what the timing is going to be. And so I think, I can't tell you what companies to invest in. What I can tell you is that there's going to be a ton of consolidation in that general space. And once you go to like multi-domain orchestration, like I don't know where those tentacles start and stop. Because now you start talking about infrastructure, and it's not even just networking or computer storage, it's like the whole thing. And if all of that gets wrapped up into the orchestration side, then how you handle that application lifecycle stuff is going to be daunting.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
Kelsey
things are getting
Hightower.
more integrated. Things are getting more integrated, and they're getting more complex. We've broken them into simple functional blocks, and now the complexity is in how to get them to work together.
Again, you make the decision and then you transition, and
That's
it's
right.
the next team of people to be hired in. So if you've got 16
Gotcha.
years of experience with Kubernetes, you can go get a job anywhere you want right now.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think that was a really, really good chat. We spent a lot of time talking about disaggregation, which is okay. It's a hot topic. I think there's a lot of opinions on what it is and what it isn't, and there's varying degrees of success in trying it out or failing at trying it out. So I think it was important that we kind of digested that a little bit. EJ, Mike, do you have any like closing thoughts before we finish up here today? Both
No,
shaking your
I
hand.
just a thank you to Mike for first of all reaching out, listening to the original podcast, and reaching out, and then joining us here on this one. I think we had a pretty good conversation there. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
You guys are doing good work. We actually need more clarity in the industry. So thank you. I mean, I think people don't realize how much effort goes into doing this kind of stuff. To pull off high quality commentary on a bunch of stuff that's really just emerging is super challenging. So I think the two of you do a great job. Keep doing it, and any kind of clarity that we can drive into the industry is helpful for everyone.
cool. Sounds good. Thank you, Mike. All right. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. I love talking vision because you can speculate more, and you can speculate without risk. So, especially on something like this, it's not like we're speaking about where our companies are necessarily heading. We're just speculating in general. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure, Mike. Thanks for taking the time today. Hopefully, we get a chance to do it again at some point. Maybe when you guys make another acquisition and we speculate correctly or incorrectly on it. All right, if you've held on this long, thank you for tuning in. We hope this was interesting, and we will definitely catch you in the next one. Hey everyone, thanks again for tuning in. As always, please do let us know any feedback or criticisms you may have. We can be reached on Twitter, YouTube, or our website, ntwr.kn, where you'll find this episode and many others posted. For those of you on YouTube, if you liked the episode, please hit that thumbs up button. And if you didn't like the episode, feel free to hit the thumbs down button twice. On a side note, you know those cliche, these are our opinions and not that of our employer statements you hear all the time? Yeah, we unfortunately have to make one of those. The benefits of working in the industry we want to publicly have an opinion about. We've done our best to remove bias, but we're only human and we make mistakes just like you. Thanks again. We'll see you in the next one.